After the capitulation of the Wehrmacht and the surrender of German troops in Germany, zones controlled by the Allied troops were established. The capital of the former Reich found itself in the Soviet zone. However, according to the agreements, East and West Berlin were to be controlled separately. East Berlin remained under Soviet control, while West Berlin was occupied by the British and American troops. On June 5, 1945, Britain allocated a portion of its occupied zone in Berlin to France, and from then on, the western part of the city was controlled by the US, Britain, and France. Immediately after the war, two Berlins emerged: East Berlin, which became the capital of East Germany in 1949, and West Berlin, which remained an enclave under the control of the Allied powers. After the war, the city lay in ruins, with many buildings collapsed and others damaged. The infrastructure and logistics of the city streets, as well as electricity, water, and gas supply, were disrupted. The city faced the threat of epidemic and famine. The German population hid indoors, afraid to go out, and the propaganda portraying Red Army soldiers as Eastern savages and barbarians took its toll. The Soviet military leadership, headed by Marshal Zhukov, made tremendous efforts to address what seemed like insurmountable problems. In many German cities, including Berlin, brigades consisting of Red Army units and local residents were organized to clean and clear the streets. Field hospitals were set up by special order to provide medical assistance to the local population. Field kitchens operated to provide food and distribute bread to the hungry in Berlin. However, aside from the general provisions and public relations, there were also inter-service issues within the German army and its associated services. With the arrival of the new army, brothels were closed and their workers were sent home. This did not mean that prostitution ceased to exist. On January 19, 1945, a decree of the Stavka No. 299 was issued, strictly prohibiting Soviet soldiers and officers from engaging in sexual relations with German women and women from liberated countries. This was done not only for moral reasons, although the moral character of soldiers and officers in the Red Army was given significant attention. The Soviet leadership was also concerned about the spread of infectious and venereal diseases within the ranks of the Red Army, and their concerns were not unfounded. In post-war Europe, tuberculosis, scurvy, hepatitis, jaundice, as it was called then, and a range of venereal diseases, including syphilis and trichomoniasis, were prevalent. While the authorities certainly could not prevent all sexual relations between Soviet soldiers and German women, a significant role was given to agitation and propaganda. Here is an example of one of the leaflets distributed by political departments among the soldiers and officers of the Red Army shortly before the end of the war. Comrades, servicemen, you are being seduced by German women. In front of you are the very women who were deliberately left behind by the enemy to spread venereal diseases and thus put our soldiers out of action. How will you be able to look into the eyes of your loved ones if you bring home an infectious disease? It must be said that such agitation, combined with punitive measures, did have an impact. Nevertheless, it could not prevent intimate relationships between Soviet soldiers and German women entirely. For many, it was a matter of survival. Writer Vladimir Gelfand recalled, "The mother of the girl I was courting was quite a cavalier. In order to gain the trust of her family, I brought gifts such as candy, butter, sausage, canned goods, and expensive German cigarettes. Some servicemen became so close to German girls that they essentially lived as husband and wife. As a result, many German women became pregnant. However, the Russian soldiers were unable to take their German wives back to the Soviet Union, as Soviet laws did not recognize such relationships. Even pregnant women or those who had given birth to children fathered by soldiers and officers of the Red Army were not allowed to enter the country." In the western sector of Berlin, where the Americans, British, and French were present, the situation regarding intimate relationships was somewhat similar. As there was hunger in West Berlin as well, soldiers of the US, British, and French armies often paid with food and other goods to the girls they liked. There were also cases of sexual violence and rape, and the perpetrators were punished. The British publication RK Review of October 25, 1945, wrote, "Homeless young girls openly offer themselves for food and lodging. It is very simple for them to sell the one and only thing they have, and they do so." In the first post-war years, for many German women, this was a matter of survival. Osmar White, a military correspondent from Australia, wrote in his diary at the end of May 1945, "The air was heavy with the stench of sewage and decaying corpses. The facade of the Finey nightclub was covered with tourist pictures, nude paintings, and advertisements. The dance hall and restaurant were filled with Russian, British, and American officers. The going rate was $25 for a hamburger made of horse meat and potatoes, $10 for a pack of American cigarettes, and a staggering $20 for a night with a Berlin woman. The women's cheeks were rouged and their lips were painted. Many wore silk stockings. The lady who was the hostess for the evening opened the concert with a speech in German, English, French, and Russian, which provoked a comment from the captain of the Russian artillery sitting next to me. He leaned over and said in good English, 'That's a quick transition from the national to the international.' Meanwhile, Dr. Stewart, in a medical report to General Eisenhower, noted that the level of venereal diseases had increased significantly over the past 6 months. A Berlin laundress, according to White, commented on the intimate relationships between German women and soldiers. 'The girls will soon drag your soldiers into bed and make them forget their orders. You'll see for yourself.' The conditions in post-war Berlin were dire, characterized by widespread destruction, shortages of essential supplies, and a demoralized population struggling to survive amidst the ruins. The desperation of the time led to various forms of human interaction, including intimate relationships between the occupying soldiers and local women. These relationships were often born out of necessity rather than mutual affection. For many German women, engaging with Allied soldiers provided a means to secure food, shelter, and other basic needs in an otherwise hopeless environment. In addition to these complex personal dynamics, the broader socio-political landscape shaped the interactions in Berlin. The Allied powers sought to establish order and stability in their respective zones of control, but the underlying tensions and differing ideologies often manifested in various aspects of daily life. The Soviet sector, for example, was marked by strict military discipline and efforts to assert control over the local population, whereas the Western sectors had their own sets of regulations and challenges. Efforts to rebuild Berlin were monumental. The city required not only physical reconstruction, but also social and economic revitalization. The process of clearing rubble, restoring utilities, and rebuilding homes and public buildings required coordination and cooperation between the occupying forces and the local German population. These efforts were hampered by shortages of materials, labor, and resources, exacerbating the difficulties faced by everyone involved. Furthermore, the psychological impact of the war and occupation on both the soldiers and the civilians cannot be understated. For many soldiers, the experience of occupying a foreign city and interacting with its residents was fraught with moral and ethical dilemmas. The propaganda efforts by all sides sought to influence behavior and attitudes, often with mixed results. For civilians, the presence of foreign troops and the breakdown of social norms created an environment of uncertainty and fear. The legacy of these interactions persisted long after the immediate post-war period. The relationships formed during this time, whether based on genuine affection, survival, or exploitation, left lasting marks on the individuals involved and on the collective memory of the communities. The children born from these unions, often referred to as occupation children, faced their own set of challenges, navigating identities shaped by their mixed heritage and the circumstances of their birth. In conclusion, the period following the end of World War II in Berlin was marked by a confluence of factors that created a complex and often painful reality for both the occupiers and the occupied. The efforts to rebuild and restore the city were accompanied by personal and societal struggles that reflected the broader challenges of transitioning from war to peace. Understanding this period requires a nuanced appreciation of the human experiences that shaped and were shaped by the historical context, revealing the interconnectedness of individual lives and the larger forces at play.